Welcome to everyone on the line to this panel discussion on reg reporting and data management. I'm Catherine Wilson, a VC investor at Illuminate, a fund focused on enterprise tech companies who are servicing the financial services industry, and I'm really looking forward to the debate on this regulator, operator, vendor panel. I'm hoping to make the discussion as fluid as possible, so if any of the panel members wish to respond or add to a point made by one another, then please do jump in so we can have a lively conversation. If not, I'll try and direct the flow of the conversation when there's a pause. A little bit of housekeeping. I understand there's also a question box on screen where you as the audience should be able to write questions for the panelists. So please make use of that and I'll incorporate them into the flow of the conversation as well. But without further ado, I'm going to get each of the panelists to introduce themselves and give us a brief overview of their roles and backgrounds to kick us off. So Chad, would you like to start?
Thanks, Catherine. My name's Chad Giussani. I'm Compliance Officer at Standard Chartered Bank. I've been involved in regulatory reporting in one way, shape or form since 2006 for the introduction of MiFID I transactional reporting. Since then, I've worked on lots and lots of other transaction reporting, derivative reporting obligations as they've come up from the 2008 credit crunch. And more recently, I've had the pleasure of working on MiFID II and SFTR. Why am I here on regulatory reporter and data management? Probably because I have a real genuine interest in it. I sit on the IST12 working group. That's the group that's responsible for the UK's input into international standards, preparation, revision and amendment of standards that relate to financial services. So things from country codes all the way through to LEIs, all sorts of things. Thanks.
Thanks, Chad. Joanne, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, my name is Joanne Horgan. I'm Chief Innovation Officer and Head of Product here at Vizor Software. Vizor Software is a leading provider of data collection platforms to regulators. So we work with about 25 regulators around the world. So we really get to see, I guess, over the last nearly 20 years, we've gotten to see a lot of the challenges in regulatory reporting and data collection. And I think some of the trends that we're seeing now with the Bank of England, FCA looking at digital regulatory reporting and the move towards more granular data. I think the idea of standardizing data and getting both the models and then the channels for data collection to a more modern place is really where we need to go. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Joanne. And Angus.
Yeah, hi all. My name is Angus Moir. I lead our data collection transformation team here at the Bank of England. So I'm responsible for the delivery of a big review that we're currently undertaking, looking at how we can improve the data collection process. And I will be responsible for delivering the outcomes of that review as well. They're likely to follow this year. My background has been data collection for the last sort of 5 years, both as part of a project that we ran with the FCA called Digital Regulatory Reporting, looking at how technology can improve the reporting process. And prior to that, undertaking a big regulatory reporting with the UK CCPs. And before that, I was basically a risk analyst on both from the sort of private and working in the public sector too.
Fantastic, thanks, Angus. Now, given the title of the panel starts with regulatory, I might start with you for the first question to help frame things. But I'd love for you to go into a little bit more detail on some of the initiatives that you have underway at the Bank of England that you think will move the regulatory reporting and data management and collection process really forward. If you could elaborate on that, it'd be great.
Sure, I think there's a couple which I've been involved with, which I think are quite interesting. So the one that we ran with the FCA and 7 financial firms, digital regulatory reporting, that was a sort of forward innovation research project. And as part of that project, we showed how we could potentially automate the regulatory reporting by publishing instructions not in PDF form as they currently are published today, but perhaps in some sort of machine executable format or regulation as code. How those instructions potentially could reference some underlying common data model, common data standards, which is mapped to our firm's operational systems. And then the instructions in the code could be executed against that data supplied according to that standard. And the result generated to the regulator And to give you a comparison, so that was kind of automation. And if you think about what the world looks like today, it can range from ad hoc collections that probably take, best case scenario, COVID, we need to get data in maybe 2 or 3 weeks, but probably more typically for a big structured collection, it could be 2, 3, or even sort of 5 years before we get to a place we're happy with. And then the other project that I'm involved in, which is kind of the follow-on from that, this is now policy. This is stuff that we're going to be doing and delivering and implementing. The data collection review has been ongoing throughout 2020. It was launched by the publication of a discussion paper that set out kind of our views on what both the issues with data collection are and potentially some of the solution areas. And will form the basis of what we're hoping to be is a transformation of data collection that hopefully will happen over the sort of the next 5 to 10, 15 years. And to give you a feel about the kind of the emerging findings from that review and what we're really excited about, we've had a strong sense that kind of common data standards and standardizing the way that firms describe and identify their data is really a core part and a key part of any solution moving forward in terms of a much data collection process. And people also, and finally, sorry, the other part as well is transforming the way we write instructions. And I think this is a really interesting topic, not just for regulatory reporting, but more broadly, but moving away from kind of paper documents and PDF documents, which are the electronic equivalents of paper documents, in terms of how we communicate with firms what it is that we'd like them to do.
I think everyone's glad to get or cut down on the paper within firms, so definitely supportive of that one. Chad, maybe from your perspective, it'd be great to understand as an operator what it was like when initiatives like Reg as Code came through and how that's been able to help you operationally, execute better and be more efficient internally.
Yeah, sure thing. I think the way that we like to operate is in an environment of certainty. So for us, it's beneficial to have things as clearly defined and as easy to understand as possible, and try and take away any element of human interpretation. So for us, I think, depending on whichever role you're in at the bank, just having certainty around sourcing and production of the data to make the reporting is absolutely essential.
Okay. And Joanne, as a vendor who's trying to piece all of this together and create solutions, I mean, what are the things that you find really helpful for you as you're defining your product and you're trying to, get the most value through to your customers?
Yeah, I think probably to reiterate what Chad is saying, the idea of certainty for any technology company, the idea of having to deal with different interpretations is very difficult. So, I mentioned we've worked with regulators on data collection for 20 years now, and one of the big challenges that we see working across 25 different countries is obviously the differences that you see in terms of data models, data standards, and we've seen very few cases so far, and it is moving that direction, but very few cases of true, I guess, efficiencies being gained through standardization. We also work in the tax side, so we work on what's known as AUI, the Automatic Exchange of Information, for the OECD, and that's one example I would say that I've seen maybe on another field where standardization has really helped. Probably the people who have to report FACA, CRS kind of data maybe don't feel that it's still a burden, but I guess from a vendor perspective, the idea of having a single data model that is applicable across multiple jurisdictions is very beneficial, and it's just a lot easier. We roll out, we work with tax authorities, we can roll out that type of solution in maybe 6 to 8 weeks, as opposed to working, Angus mentioned there, when you're working with data collections or new requirements where it's going through a very kind of analog process still, that can take a significant amount of time, and we do see just another slight, I guess, differences maybe between some jurisdictions we work with. So in Africa, for example, we're working with the Bank of Ghana, and they've rolled out not so much on the data standard size, but more on the collection format and method. We're collecting loan level data via API from all of the industry. So all of their reporting is supported in a sort of machine to machine way. It's kind of easier to do that maybe in a smaller jurisdiction. You can bring in these changes a lot faster, whereas I think, in somewhere like the UK, it does take a lot more consultation with the industry, and any sort of changes to collection or reporting standards will take some time to come through.
Mm-hmm. Maybe another question for Chad. I mean, one of the things that we see as an investor is, and we're kind of always curious to get practitioners' views on, is whether or not you see the innovation coming through is being driven by internal processes, so better standardization regs, better kind of definition and more, more process optimization, or it being driven by some kind of new technology. So, NLP being able to scan a document and extract the right things so that you can, streamline processes in that way. It'd be great to get your view on, what you see driving advances in the reg reporting and data management space, if it's tech or if it's just processes and operational efficiency.
I tend to see it as driven by the process and efficiency, the striving for better process efficiency and control. There aren't many times where we go out just looking for new tech to resolve something. So shall we say, we don't just adopt tech because it's new. We have the problem statement and the way that the funding cycle works at the bank. You don't just get assigned your budget. You write your problem statement, your business case of what you're going to need it for, and then you might go away and conduct a full RFP process to find out what's the best solution fit for your demand. So I do see it as that. But the banks are striving all the time for better and better outcomes and solutions. So I think of all the places where I've worked, I've never really seen what you'd call a static environment. There's always something strategic, something that's tactical that needs replacing, whether it's a golden source of data, shared platforms, shared standards, data lakes, whatever you want to call them. There's always that constant ebb and flow of, things are going somewhere. And what we're seeing now, what we will see more of, is the regulators are getting more bought into that as well. And they now see it, the opportunities that the technology can provide. If you look at, for example, the FCA's own transactional reporting systems, they've built that all using Amazon Web Services, and it's all very high availability, very scalable. So we've ended up with a reporting platform and end destination that was far more stable than perhaps things we saw under the MiFID I regime. So I think technology is enabling regulation to be better and reporting to be better. And we're on a journey, and we're not by any means there yet, but things are just generally improving. And when I see how our reporting is now, when I started in the mid-90s, late 90s on transactional reporting to where we are now, and we have a database full of European instruments, and we have data standards that allow you to effectively identify your counterpart in such a way as anyone can understand who that party is. I think this is all real advancement.
Angus, is there anything that you'd add from your perspective there? Are there some things or technologies that you think that regulatory bodies can be learning from or adopting?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think as an institution, as part of the financial system, we're always interested in understanding and exploring new ways of doing things and new technologies. And we have an advanced analytics area within the bank who are particularly interested in the application of kind of new and exploring the application of new analytical techniques and machine learning and AI and things like this to what the bank does, and seeing if we can do things better as a result. I think one of as the private sector, as Chad says, you've got to make sure that whatever you're doing, you're doing it to solve a particular problem or an issue and to make things better, and not just using things for the sake of it. And I think the other thing as well, which I think is critical for us, is analytics is great, but you need to have the data to do analytics on. And I think we probably have some, certainly within, I think, the financial sector and the people I speak to, we have some pretty big foundational fundamental issues. That means that getting the data in the right place and the right shape before it can be analysed is actually a pretty tough task, and it's currently pretty expensive and inefficient. And so if we really want to unlock some of these analytical techniques and get to a place where I think people kind of aspirationally want us to get to, then I think there's quite a lot of hard work for that to be done first.
And what do you think, Angus, just on that, you said get it to the right format or the right, I think that's probably where some of the challenge lies, right? What, you hear that from banks, what a regulator considers is the right format or what they want is so far removed from the operational standards used in banks. And I guess that's why we're talking about data standards, right? there is that challenge for banks.
Yeah, no, I think one of the as you say, one of the challenges is that certainly we do look at the world sometimes from a different perspective to how organizations do. And one of the interesting things and one of the nature of analytics in general is that analytics kind of reflects the world in the sense of we don't always agree about what is the right way of looking at data and for instance, the right way of valuing things or modeling things, etc. And that's true of us as a regulator as much as it's true of people who work internally within firms. I think the key thing, and I think that kind of reflects a couple of things. I think, well, that has a couple of implications. One is, despite all of that, when we look at the underlying facts where the data is generated, we're looking at the same set of fundamental ingredients across the industry, no matter who you are within the firm or us as a regulator. I think that's one thing to be aware of, and I think that's really where we should be focusing our standardization efforts. And the second thing is, that doesn't mean that just standardizing those facts is the only thing we need to do. Speaking to this point about the fact that we do have a different perspective, we do have different ways of looking at things. We need a better way, a more efficient way of communicating the context or the way that we're thinking about the world to firms to enable them to produce the data that we want much more efficiently than is currently the case.
There's a question that's come in from the audience that I might direct at you, Joanne. So allow me to read this out, and you'll see I've directed at you in a second. Isn't there a paradox here? Not necessarily on reducing ambiguity and reducing differences in interpretation, but in accentuating standardization amongst jurisdictions. If the role of RegTech for reporting is to be seen as solving the costs of multiple reporting in diversity, wouldn't standardization reduce its value? And if the cost of regulatory reporting does decrease, would it make sense for regulators to experiment more on how to collect data? So I guess, is there a bit of a question hidden in there, which is the more standardization that kind of comes in, does it mean the opportunity for RegTechs, does that diminish, and is that a paradox there?
Well, I think if you look at it, I'll be honest about it. There are a lot of companies make money out of the complexity that's there, right? And I don't think that's, I'm not trying to take away anybody's business, but I mean, I think if we look at it, it is a little bit ridiculous what happens today. So you have a regulator who defines what needs to be collected, for example, and generally they are defining that in some. Maybe not the most efficient way today, but they are defined in some machine readable way or some data model today. When that is released to the industry with guidance notes, whatever it is in PDF, you have a whole other set of people that have to try and interpret, what is this data model going to look like? How am I going to map my data to it? I just think, yes, the cost of regulatory reporting should come down. That's part of it. I mean, if you look at standardizing data and improving the overall process of how regulatory change is released to the industry, costs should reduce, and that's a good thing. I can't see why, and I think that's probably where we are at the moment. We're sort of at a tipping point that you can't just keep adding change. You can't keep adding regulatory requirements, people to processes within banks. You can't keep increasing the size of your compliance team. And yeah, I mean, if that's what it means that there is maybe less, I don't say there's less opportunity. I still think there's opportunity there for RegTech firms to help solve that problem. But they should be able to, I used the example earlier about the tax side of our business, for example. We can do those projects in 8 weeks. It's still a good business to be in. It doesn't mean that it's a something that is not as expensive or doesn't cost as much as it used to, for example. That doesn't mean it's a bad business to be in. It just means that costs are reducing to maybe what they should be, as opposed to this very high level because of a lot of the manual effort that needs to happen today.
Can I just follow up on that quickly, just to say that, I mean, we speak to a lot of sort of vendors and RegTechs, not just in terms of the regulatory reporting space, but more broadly. And I think there's a general understanding that actually standards, to a certain extent, should be enablers of the RegTech industry. It should be about creating an ecosystem which is perhaps more competitive, more dynamic, with more opportunities for firms to exploit opportunities than currently we have today. Because at the moment, for instance, one of the reasons perhaps the market isn't as dynamic as we like it to be is because the cost of changing between firms is really, really high, because there aren't the standards in place so that if I wanted to install or to move from one vendor to another, I'm pretty fixed with where I've got to. So I think there's a lot of firms out there pretty frustrated that actually they feel like they've got a better product than some of their competitors, but they're unable to compete because of the cost of change is just so high.
Is there anything you'd comment on that, Chad, on your side as the operator?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, we look at standardization of the components of the reporting, or just because that gives us certainty about how we construct the reports. But that you have to understand that the fields, the individual components, they're like the words in a book. They don't necessarily mean anything until they're, as Angus said, they're put into context. And so if you regard each line in your report as trying to set the context to tell the story of what took place, regardless of whatever it is, whether it whether it's a tax report or a transaction report, as long as it conveys the right meaning, the semantics of what took place, that's what's important. So when we look at the standardization of the elements that form the data, I think that's a reasonable place to start. You start with the dictionary of verbiage that everyone understands. So if you talk about a venue, is it a venue of execution? Is it a regulated market? Well, if you need both, then define both. Don't just sit there and put the word venue, right? Just be more precise. Give us certainty about what it is you're trying to capture, and then we know what to put in the fields. And so where we've seen good work is with the IOSCO folk that are trying to harmonize the components of data elements that make up transaction reporting. So they've done it in several tranches where they've sat there and said, right, here are the critical data elements. Let's make them all look the same. And it's silly things like under MiFID 1, you used to report in the local time of the country you were in. So all of the European reporting, London local, summertime, wintertime, we would have to change the clocks. At least now we report in universal time. So if I'm sharing it with a different regulator, we all know that the trade time took place at that time in universal time. And so we can piece together, it doesn't matter where on the planet you are, you know what that time is compared to where you are. So it's so, timestamps prevalent in the reporting industry. Just having them universal time was actually a major step forward.
Yeah. And maybe a follow-up then, Joanne, I mean, if you look at all of the different reporting standards, what do you see as the role of each of the different industry stakeholders and participants in helping to feed in and set these, be it new RegTechs or the regulator or vendors or operators?
I mean, I think in terms of data standardization, I think it can't be led by one party. I think that there does need to be a lead from the regulator, as the Bank of England are looking at now. But ideally, if you have I guess we're not going to get to maybe a global standardization, but if we were to get that, we have the LEI, for example, which is a global standard. Then it really needs to be something that's led by a global standard setting agency. Where possible, I think for regulatory reporting, we should move to using something as close as possible to operational standards that are there already. That would be my view. I think, the more granular you get with data, the more, the closer to source, if you like. Even though I know banks, they all have different source systems, there will still be an element of transformation that has to happen. But the closer you get to I guess, an operational standard that's in use already, the better. You're just going to be cutting out the major part and the major cost of regulatory reporting, which is that transformation and implementation of regulatory change. So RegTech vendors, I think, yes, they have a role to play in terms of maybe, providing guidance on what works for technology, what type of standards do we need. But, you'll find with technologists, once it's in a language that they can work with, or it's in a data model, whether it doesn't really matter if it's XML or JSON or whatever the format is from a technical perspective, it doesn't really matter. I think for them it would be more about certainty about who is driving the change when changes to standards happen. But I think it is collaborative. You do need to get the opinion of lots of different people, because there's a lot of legacy out there, I would say. So That'd be my view. Yeah.
Just pausing to see if either of you two wanted to jump in, but if not.
I was going to say, I mean, this has been a really kind of hot topic for our data collection review work that we've done so far. We spent a lot of time talking about, if data standards are so important, what should the Bank of England's role be in the process? And the kind of the general feedback we've got is that it can't just be us, it can't just be the Bank of England. Particularly, I think, echoing Joanne's point about, if you want to get close to operational data, which I think is probably the most effective in the longer term. We don't have the expertise around the operational data, around the subject matter to really be the only ones in the room. But on the flip side, there was kind of a strong call from industry to say that, like, without you, we don't think it will happen. As industry, people have tried before, and in particular, developing a standard is one thing, but adopting a standard is another, and that's a really big barrier. And perhaps that's where regulators can play the most sort of useful and the strongest role in using data collection as a tool to start pushing the adoption of these standards and trying to build a critical mass where the business case for standard adoption kind of really clearly adds up.
We've seen ESMA take a real step forward with the adoption of ISO 20022 as the language of reporting for Europe, to the point where through that IST working group that I attend, we get the annual changes to the ISO standard, and a lot of them are being put forward by ESMA to make it a better and better, more fit standard for reporting. So maybe that's something I'm sure that came through on our feedback to you, Angus, from Standard Chartered, that IST 12 is a great vehicle for getting the standards amended and altered to do the things that you need them to do as a regulator as well.
Yeah, and I think there have been examples, in the past, we've mentioned there have been attempts at standardization, and there's in Australia, for example, they've got the SBR, which is Standard Business Reporting. This was XBRL mostly based, but what seemed to happen there over a number of years was multiple government agencies defining, as you say, data dictionary or data definitions, definitional taxonomy, for example. But I think, what happened there over time maybe is that they found, yes, there are some things in common between multiple agencies, but then there's also quite different requirements. So for example, APRA might have wanted to collect something quite different to the Australian Tax Office. And over time, there got to be a little bit of divergence, I think, in the model. So I think that's where regulators and maybe global standard setters can play a really big part, is in almost the governance of change and how change happens, and making sure that that's done in a sort of a machine readable way, or a way that's very easy for people to keep up with.
Maybe a kind of a slightly different question. We've spoken a lot about standardization and data management, reporting standardization, and what's required from a regulatory perspective. But maybe a comment from each of you would be fantastic to understand how you think about, data management and collection for reporting versus data management and collection for operational insights and improvement, and how you think about balancing both of them, whether it's we have to know this to report against it for, systemic stability, or we need to, learn from this so that we can offer better services through to our own clients. So maybe Chad, we could start with you on that.
Yeah, I was at a bank probably about 7-8 years ago, and they were building a huge reporting system, and that was driven by regulatory imperative, Dodd-Frank and EMIR coming in, and the idea is that they centralised, created this great big data lake, and bits of information came at it from all sorts of different places. But I remember speaking to one of the COOs, and he said, well, actually, this thing that we're building, absolutely, we need it to do the reg reporting. He said, what I'd really like is to build analytical tools off the back of it, to understand my clients' trading patterns, to understand how we might be able to sell them other products, other services. I don't think, I'm obviously not been at that bank for a while, but I'm not sure they ever got there with that idea. But that was a marvelous example of what could be done with the data that we're storing up. And we seem to be like data magpies, right? We just collect data and we store it in places, but actually taking it out and extracting, get some extra value whilst remaining broadly compliant with our regulatory obligations, but actually deriving good business value and MI about our clients and their habits. And that's probably an evolution that hasn't yet happened.
And do you see, Chad, just on that, I mean, would you see that, because I hear that a little bit as well, you've got your kind of reg reporting silo of data, or, you know, data comes in for reg reporting purposes, whereas the sort of run the business data or the operational data is you know, is separate to that. And I guess, you know, that's probably part of that is because the end format, or the way it's getting into that format for the regulator, a lot of banks are saying it's not valuable to them. They don't necessarily, you know, if it's at an aggregate level, for example, at the end, they don't necessarily see value there. Whereas I think if it gets closer, you know, as we're talking about, if it does get closer to something that's standardized, not operational level, you might be able to get more value out of that data.
Yeah, I'd say that's absolutely it. It's about where I talked a bit earlier about, you know, you've got your blocks of data, you've got your fields, you've got your components, but it's being able to use that as a language that makes sense to people, that adds the context, that adds a story around what you've done and what you've stored, and reconstructing it and then articulating that back to someone to derive their value and their meaning from it. And I think, you know, I'd like to think we're going to get there. It just seems that, you know, the tsunami of regulation has yet to abate. We've still got more and more regulation coming down the pipe. We've got amendments to existing regulation. You know, we expect EMIR reporting to change next year. We've got new US regulations for SEC reporting. So nothing's really stopped, and any regulation that's there is constantly evolving anyway. We probably haven't had that moment to step back and breathe and think about what else we can do with the data, but hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah.
And I was going to echo, I guess, Chad and perhaps Joe and Joanne alluded to this question that you know, when we speak to people around industry, there's a kind of common sense, which is that sort of the analytics and reporting processes at the moment within organizations are pretty siloed. So there's one team doing management reporting, another team doing analytics to, you know, look how can we better serve our customers, another team looking at you know, external reporting to us and to, you know, for financial disclosure reasons. And all of those processes are pretty siloed, it's pretty inefficient because the underlying raw ingredients that they all start from are not standardized, they're not stored consistently. So everyone kind of builds these independent pipelines. And I think people generally see the opportunity space here for actually, if we can sort that underlying foundations out and we can recorrect that and sort those out, then, you know, we should be able to make all those other processes, whether it's, you know, reporting to regulators, doing better analytics for internal purposes, are much easier, much more efficient than we do today.
And no doubt the move to a more cloud-based data infrastructure will definitely help kind of connect some of those siloed pieces. So hopefully that can be a tech driver for some of the innovation to come in this space as well. I've got another question on here that I'm going to read out. And I think this one's best directed at you, Angus. As you look at data standardization, the question is more, does it make more sense for regulators to collaborate across country versus just kind of collaborating within the industry kind of group that they're working in? So, you know, should the BOE be doing more with like the SEC so that an organization can have that kind of regional standardization versus internal?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something we're thinking about quite a lot. I guess to kind of start to caveat, you know, we as an organization, you know, we're actually relatively small. We're sort of 4,000 people in total. And when you break it down into all the bits that we do and you get down to people looking at this topic, it's not many people. So we do have to think about this quite hard because we've only got a certain amount of resource. And I guess it also speaks to, you know, we see this as a long-term vision, a long-term project. And so to a certain extent, even if we can't, you know, with some pretty lofty, ambitious aims, so if we can't do everything at once, kind of what's the most effective way of us getting to our aims? And so certainly we would love to, you know, we think that, you know, in the long run, these data standards should be international. They shouldn't just be for the UK. We think they should probably be closer to operational data than perhaps standards which people are looking at now should be. But I guess so. So there's definitely an element of trying to pursue internationally where possible. But we think potentially, in the earlier phases, and this certainly isn't kind of the Bank of England's strategic view. I guess our current feeling is we're leaning towards more industry collaboration, trying to show something that works, kind of build a prototype or build a model that works, which we can then be transparent and open about, and invite people in and show them, look, if we move this way, if you adopt these standards, then this is what you could deliver internationally too.
Another question on here that I might direct at you, Chad. The question is, could there be a transition away from sending trade reporting data to regulators to a situation where, what would your reaction be to regulators pulling relevant data directly from you, the financial institution? Could that cause standardization?
Yeah, I think that actually came up in Angus's consultation, right? The pull me model as opposed to the push. And if I'm not mistaken, that was not the preferred adopted method by the banks that were around the table. How do I feel about it? I've been talking about how it could look going forward. We still run for MiFID reporting. It's still a very 1990s model, right? You report via an arm and they load it into a system at the FCA, and that's how it was under MiFID 1. That's very much how it was under the Investor Services Directive prior to that in the 90s. What could different look like, and cloud-based and rules engines, 300 firms around the city each build a rules engine to do the same reporting. Why isn't there one rules engine that we all plumb into? So giving the data up, I suspect that banks don't feel that comfortable with that idea, but certainly having more open platforms, one singular rules engine that's been built and attested to by both the reporting participants and the regulator would be interesting. Cloud-based storage, retrieval, sharing, that would obviously help with the consumption at the far end as well. So definitely there are steps that can be taken there. We just probably haven't thought about using them. I'd hate to have to send in a spreadsheet. Conversely, I don't want a regulator walking up and down our internal systems, because quite frankly, it would probably make their hair go curly and they wouldn't enjoy the experience.
Joanne, I'm conscious of time, so I might ask Joanne actually. From a product vendor's point of view, is that kind of fantastic out there thinking, or would it be a total, would it be very hard for you to implement as a vendor?
I don't think there is. Do you mean the pull, or do you mean that kind of idea of a cloud shared rules engine? Because
either.
Yeah, I think the there's nothing difficult. There's no technological barriers to implementing something like you described there, Chad. Sort of more of a, I don't want to call it utility, but more of a shared platform. I would say that's, you could do that tomorrow if you wanted. In terms of the Vizor software, we can do pull or push data today via API, for example. So I don't think the technology is the challenge. I think what the barrier is today, some of it is the legacy architecture and IT systems that you have in place at banks and even at the regulator. I don't see that there would be any difficulty in terms of implementing a cloud-based shared rules engine, publishing standards in a machine-readable way. I think all of the components of that are already there today. I think what it needs is a very clear use case and a very clear approach that would be acceptable, I guess, to all parties. I think that's probably, some things we see a little bit is you've got to consider not just the big banks, the big global banks. You've got to consider all of the other regulated entities as well, and what's going to work for them.
Fantastic. We're hitting 2 o'clock, so apologies I didn't get to all of the questions, but hopefully I managed to answer a good cross section of them. And thank you to the panelists for the fantastic conversation and debate, and also to the organisers. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks everyone for participating.
Thanks all.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks.